Hello guys, my name is Oluwaseun Aziz and I'll be taking this section of the systematic review course on Prisma. Prisma stands for the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And this aspect of the course is divided into two, Prisma 1 and Prisma 2. Prisma 1 covers the items in the Prisma checklist from items 1 to items 22, while Prisma 2 covers the items from 23 upwards. It is important to note that Prisma 1 should be taken before Prisma 2 as it is a continuum. So as I mentioned earlier, Prisma stands for the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. And Prisma essentially provides a guideline for reporting systematic reviews in a transparent manner. As we all know, systematic reviews are at the peak of the hierarchy of evidence. And it's very important that they are reported in a transparent manner and reported in a manner as free of bias as possible, as systematic reviews are important to a lot of stakeholders, including policymakers, and of course, frequently influence policies. There are several components of the Prisma, and one of the components is the Prisma checklist. The other component is the Prisma flow diagram. The Prisma checklist is a 27 item checklist that majorly ensures comprehensive reporting of your systematic review. The Prisma flow diagram, on the other hand, is a flow diagram, a flow chart that helps to visualize the study selection process. It's very important to adhere to the Prisma framework because adhering to the Prisma framework ensures transparent reporting, which enhances the credibility of your systematic review. So prior to the development of the Prisma 2020 framework, there was a Prisma that was in effect, and that was the Prisma 2009. The Prisma 2020, however, is an updated guideline for reporting systematic reviews. So the Prisma 2020 guides reporting systematic reviews, evaluating the effects of health interventions. So Prisma framework can be used for qualitative or quantitative studies. It can be used for living reviews. It can be used for original systematic reviews. Can be used for to update a systematic review. There are some features of the Prisma 2020 framework, and one of the features is the comprehensive checklist, which is the 27 item checklist that I mentioned earlier. This checklist essentially acts as a guide for how to report the systematic review. It covers sections such as the introduction, the methods, the results, and discussion sections of your systematic review reports. Once again, the Prisma 2020 helps with transparent reporting. It also reflects recent advances in systematic review methodology and terminology. The Prisma 2020 also comes with a guide, an explanation, and elaboration which covers each of the 27 item checklists in explicit details, citing examples of how such items should be reported. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Prisma flow diagram is a flow diagram, a flow chart that illustrates the study selection process in systematic reviews. So it has several components. The records identified, the records screened, the full text assessment, studies included, studies excluded. And the purpose of the flow diagram is to just show the study selection process in an interactive manner, in an interactive and easy to visualize manner. So this is an example of the Prisma flow charts, and it has several sections: the identification section, the screening section, the included section. And what you want to do essentially is to show all the databases from which um, you retrieved records. So you want to mention all the databases as well as the number of records you retrieved from each database. Databases could be PubMed, could be Cochrane Library, could be Science Direct, could be Google Scholar, could be several databases and or registers, and you want to record the number of records retrieved per database or register. So in this section, you want to talk about the records that were removed before screening. So um, if you removed duplicate records, you want to clearly mention the number. If you passed your search results through automation through tools such as Rayan, and by virtue of that, we're able to um, remove some ineligible records. You want to mention the number. If you removed records due to other reasons, you want to state what reason and also um, include the number of records that were removed per reason. So you then go to the records screened, the records that made it through to your full text screening. You put the records excluded because they did not meet your inclusion criteria. You want to then you put the reports sought for retrieval, and then those you were not able to retrieve, the reports assessed for eligibility, and then those that were excluded for whatsoever reason, and then lower. So moving on to the Prisma checklist. As I mentioned earlier, the Prisma checklist is a guide, a 27 item guide for reporting your systematic review. So it covers several aspects from the introduction down to the methods to the results and discussion aspects of your systematic review. However, the Prisma item actually starts from the title. So item 1 has to do with the title of your systematic review. And it's very important that your title identifies your report as a systematic review. So generic terms such as review, literature review, evidence synthesis, or knowledge synthesis, which people commonly use, are not recommended because they don't distinguish between systematic and non-systematic approaches. And you want to clearly indicate that your study is a systematic review. Another mistake people commonly make is that they use the term systematic review and meta-analysis interchangeably. However, they are separate things. A systematic review refers to the entire set of processes used to identify, to select, and to synthesize your evidence. Meanwhile, a meta-analysis refers only to the statistical aspect, so the statistical synthesis aspect. You can also do a meta-analysis outside a systematic review or vice versa. So once again, in Prisma 1, you want to identify your report as a systematic review in the title. A good example of a title that works and fits the item 1 criteria for Prisma is a systematic review comparing the therapeutic effects of heparin versus warfarin in patients with deep venous thrombosis. So that clearly identifies your report as a systematic review. We then move on to talk about item 2. Item 2 talks about the abstracts, the way the abstracts should be reported. I won't go into so much details about this because there is a Prisma 2020 abstract checklist on its own. However, the abstract checklist majorly follows the checklist for this Prisma 27 item checklist. So once you have a solid understanding of the Prisma 27 item checklist, you should be able to figure out the 2020 abstract checklist as well. You can consult results. You can consult literature for access to the Prisma 2020 abstract checklist. So moving on to item 3. So item 3 talks about the background and the rationale for your research. So in this, you want to describe the current states of knowledge as well as the uncertainties around your study. You want to also articulate why it is important to do the review. So you want to justify why your systematic review is necessary. If there are other systematic reviews addressing the same question, you want to explain why it's necessary to do your own review. So, for example, it's possible that previous reviews could be out of date, previous reviews could have discordant results, or there may be new review methods available to address your review question. Or it could even be that the existing reviews have flaws in their methodology. So, for whatsoever reason, it's important to clearly state it so that readers of your paper can understand why it is necessary for your systematic review to be conducted. Next, we move to item 4. Item 4 of the Prisma checklist refers to the objectives or the research questions. So in this particular section, you want to clearly state all your objectives and talk about your research question. So one of the things you could use is that you could use the PICO framework. There are several frameworks, but the PICO framework is a framework that can be used if your systematic review is assessing the effects of interventions. There are other frameworks. This is an aspect of the course that will be covered later on, the aspect of frameworks. So this leads us to the next item, which is item 5. Item 5 focuses on, from item 5, we get into the method section. And that just outlines how you conducted your systematic review. Item 5 focuses on eligibility criteria. In item 5, you want to specify your inclusion and exclusion criteria and how the studies were grouped for your synthesis. So you want to clearly specify the population, the intervention, the comparison, the outcomes of the study design criteria. That is also another framework that could be used to report your eligibility criteria, the PICO's framework. So, in summary, in this section, you want to define the criteria for including and excluding studies in your systematic review. We then move on to item 6. In item 6, you want to talk about the information sources. So your databases, the registers, the websites, and sources that you searched and consulted to identify studies. So you want to include them. As I mentioned earlier, I mentioned a few of them: PubMed, Embase, Cochrane Library. It could be even registers. It could be green literature that you made use of. Whatsoever database you used, you have to clearly state them and also describe them, and also say when you searched that database. So this section essentially reports the what and when of how you searched of your sources. So the what and when of your sources. So what sources did you search and when did you search those sources? So next we'll be talking about item 7, which is the search strategy. So for search strategy, in this talks about the how of the search. So how did you conduct your search? In this section, you want to present the full search strategy for all the databases, all the registers and websites that you used. So you want to detail your search terms, the Boolean operators. You also want to mention if you made use of any limits such as maybe dates, maybe limiting to languages, to English, to studies in English alone. And you want to justify this by linking back to your review's eligibility criteria, which we discussed earlier. So, for example, it's possible that one of your eligibility criteria could be studies in English, and that could have been a reason for you to limit your search during your search strategy. You also want to mention if you made use of any filter. So filters such as searching for just randomized trials, um, and you also want to justify your reasons for justify your use of the filter. So this takes us to the next item, which covers the selection process. So here you want to talk about the selection process. You want to talk about how you screened and selected studies. You want to talk about how many reviewers worked on your study. In this section, we're still screening the title and abstract of each record. So how many reviewers screened each record, and if there were multiple reviewers, if they worked independently, by which I mean, were they unaware of each other's decisions? That is, was they blind review? If it was a blind review, several methods could have also been used. An example being having 30 records and dividing the records and assigning the first 15 records to one reviewer to screen and the last set of records to the other reviewer, to the second reviewer to screen. You could also have done it such that both reviewers would have had to screen all 30 records, and then disagreements between both reviewers would have been resolved either through consensus or would even be resolved by a third reviewer. So, however, whatever method you used has to be clearly stated in this section. You also have to report any process you use to obtain or confirm relevant information from study investigators. So if some of the abstracts or articles require translation into another language to determine their eligibility, you also have to report how they were translated. For example, by using software programs or by asking a native speaker, whatever method has to be clearly stated. If you made use of automation tools, you also have to state whether the records were excluded solely based on machine assessments or whether the machine assessments were used to double check human decisions. So whatsoever method you used has to be explicitly stated. Then we move on to the next item, item 9, which has to do with the data collection processes. For this item, you want to specify the method used to collect data from reports. So the process of extracting data from your included studies. You want to include how many reviewers collected data from each report. You also want to mention whether they worked independently or not and how they resolved disagreements. You want to report any processes used to obtain or confirm relevant information from study investigators. You also want to mention if you made use of any automation tool. You also want to clearly state that. If you use any software to extract data from figures, you also have to specify the software used. So next we'll be taking item 10. Item 10 talks about the data items. So in item 10, you want to list the specific data items collected from each study. So you want to list and define the outcome domains. You want to include your primary, at least you want to list you want to include your primary and secondary outcomes, your adverse events, and other relevant information also has to be clearly stated. So next we'll be talking about item 11, which is the study risk of bias assessment. So you have to explain how you assess the risk of bias in the included studies, and you have to clearly mention the tools used. There are several tools that could be used. It could have been the Cochrane risk of bias tool that was used. You also have to mention which domains were assessed. So next, we'll be talking about the effect measures, which is item 12. In item 12, you want to specify for each of the outcomes the effect measure used. So by effect measures, I mean these are statistical constructs. I mean things like risk ratio, mean difference, And this essentially are just statistical constructs that are used to compare outcome data between two groups. So essentially, you just want to compare outcome data between two groups, and there are different ones that could be used. Could be risk ratios, could be mean difference, could be odd ratios. And you want to explain how you calculated effect sizes as well. So next, we'll be talking about item 13. In item 13, you want to just describe the process you used to decide which studies were eligible for your synthesis. That's the first thing. Then you want to go ahead to talk about how you synthesized data across studies. So you considered multiple studies, and did you do a meta-analysis? Did you do a narrative synthesis? You want to also mention if you made use of any statistical software. So, for example, RevMan or R. So, essentially, you just want to talk about how you synthesized data across the studies that made it true and were included in your systematic review. So next we'll be talking about item 14. So in item 14, we'll be reporting bias assessment. So this essentially means that we want to address any potential reporting bias due to missing results. And this frequently arises from reporting biases such as selective non-publication or selective non-reporting of results. That means you intentionally do not report something that should be reported in your results, or do not publish something that should be published in your results. So you want to explain how you assessed these biases. So, for example, it could be through using tools, it could be through a graphical method, through statistical method, or even any other method as also clearly stated. So some of the statistical so some of the methods, the graphical methods that exist, statistical methods that exist, for example, using funnel plots or using Edgar's tests. Those are going to give you an idea of the potential for bias as a result of missing results. So next we'll be talking about item 15, which which addresses the certainty assessment. So when we talk about certainty, we are referring to the confidence in the body of evidence for an outcome. So in this section, you want to describe the method you used to assess your confidence in the body of evidence for each outcome. And you're going to do this for each of the outcomes. So you want to mention the criteria you're using to evaluate. The possible criteria could be the grade criteria, which is the grading of recommendations, assessments, development, and evaluation criteria. So you want to describe the decision rules you used to arrive at your judgment of the certainty of evidence, whether it is high, whether it is moderate, low, or very low. So you want to state all these things. So essentially, you also want to report if you make use of any automation to support your assessment of certainty. So you want to report how the automation tool was used, if any, how the tool was trained, and details on the tool's performance and internal validation. So next we move to the next item, which is item 16, which addresses the study selection. So in this section, you want to describe the process of screening titles, abstracts, and in-text. So step by step. So the initial stage is to talk about screening the titles and abstracts. And the way to report this ideally is using the Prisma flow diagram, which I have earlier discussed. So I won't go into so much details. But essentially, you want to use the Prisma flow diagram to describe how you went through the search process. So you want to report, ideally using a flow diagram, the number of records identified, records excluded before you went ahead to screen. Maybe they were duplicates or they were ineligible by the automation tool you used. You want to mention the records screened, the records excluded after screening titles or abstracts. You want amount of reports that you were able to retrieve, those that were not retrievable for the table evaluation, those that did not meet the inclusion criteria, and your reasons for exclusion. Maybe it was an ineligible study design or an ineligible population or whatsoever reason you want to mention that. You also want to cite studies that appear to meet your inclusion criteria but which were excluded, and you want to explain why they were excluded. So you also want to essentially that. So whatsoever reason you have for excluding a study, you want to specify. So in summary, you want to specify the inclusion and exclusion criteria which apply. So next we'll be talking about item 17, which is on study characteristics. So for item 17, you want to cite each included study and present its findings. So this has to do with each study in your report. So say for example 70 articles made it through. You want to take each of those. Okay, 70 is a bit more. Say 30 articles made it through. You want to take each of those 30 articles and cite each of them and present each of the characteristics. So it's recommended that you present the key details, the key characteristics of each study in a table or in a figure, because you want something that will make it easy to facilitate comparison of characteristics across the studies. And you want something that would look clear, would be clear and easy to relate to for the readers, where readers will find it easy to isolate data. So you want to include details, also the key characteristics of each study in the table. So details like the sample size, the study design, the demographics of the participants, the specifics of the intervention as well could also be included. So next we'll move to item 18. Item 18, we're talking about risk of bias in studies. So we're talking about here you want to present your assessment of the risk of bias for each included study. So here we're already talking about the risk of bias for each of the included studies. So you want to present tables, once again, tables, so it's clear. So tables or figures indicating for each study, so each study in your report, the risk of bias in each domain that you assessed. So you mention which tool you also use. So if you made use of Cochrane, risk of bias tool, that's a possible tool that could be used for risk of bias. You want to mention that, or which other risk of bias tool you use. You want to discuss potential sources of bias and how you avoided bias, how you mitigated them, perhaps through randomization, through blinding. You want to mention if the potential source of bias, if the bias came in positive through selective reporting. You want to talk about all these things, and you also want to talk about the level of bias as well. So next we'll be talking about item 19. For item 19 here, from item 19, we are moving into the results section of the systematic review, how to report your results. So for item 19, you want to report the results for individual studies. So individual studies that make up your review. So you want to summarize key findings from each study. Again, you could use a table for this. So you want to summarize key findings from each study. You want to include effect estimates. So effect estimates are, as I mentioned earlier, there are things like they're just statistical constructs that are used to compare between two groups. So we're looking at things like mean differences, odd ratios. So mean differences, odd ratios, and you also want to include their precision as well. That is their confidence intervals. So once again, it's advisable that you structure tables or plots for clarity. So next, we'll be talking about item 20. So for item 20, you'll be talking about the results of the synthesis, that is the result of the systematic review itself. So here you want to combine results across your the studies that you're considering. So possibly through doing a narrative synthesis or through doing the meta-analysis. So whichever one you're using, you want to
talk about it in details. Then you want to present the overall effect estimates for each of the outcomes and their confidence intervals. Then you also want to explain any heterogeneity if applicable. So when we talk about heterogeneity, we're just essentially talking about any kind of variability that exists among studies in a systematic review. So any variability once again that exists among studies in your systematic review. So there are different types of heterogeneity. So variability in the studies in your systematic review could be from various things. It could be from a variability in the participants, the interventions, or the outcomes that you study. For that, we call that clinical heterogeneity. So it could be a variability in the study design or risk of bias. That is a methodological heterogeneity. So when there's a variability in study design, for example, you have a study and you're doing a systematic review and you've included randomized control trials, you've included cohort studies, and also you have various study designs. Could also be a variability uh, in the intervention effects being evaluated. Also, that is, and how you're evaluating the intervention effects. So that is a statistical heterogeneity. So, however, whichever heterogeneity is involved, you want to explicitly state which heterogeneity and how you also want to talk about it. So, how it affects, how it has a bearing on your study. So, next we'll be talking about item 21, which has to do with reporting biases, uh, reporting the risk of bias in the systematic. So here you want to present the assessment of risk of bias due to missing results for each synthesis assessed. So previously we talked about the risk of bias, but that was applicable to single studies, so to studies that make up your systematic review. This is larger. This is risk of bias has a bearing on the systematic review itself. So you want to address any reporting bias, could be publication bias or whatever bias it is. You want to present that bias. You also want to describe the methods you used to assess and to mitigate the bias. For example, it could be that you created funnel plots to assess bias. So finally, we'll be talking about item 22, which is talking about the certainty of evidence. So for item 22, you want to present assessments of certainty in the body of evidence for each outcome assessed. So when we talk about certainty, we want to be talking about confidence. So what is your level of confidence in the body of evidence for each of the outcomes that you're assessing? So you're assessing anxiety. What is your level of confidence in the evidence you've generated for anxiety? So you want to evaluate the quality of evidence for each outcome. So using whatsoever criteria. The possible criteria once again could be the grade criteria. Or if you're not using the grade criteria, you have to state which criteria you are using. And then you have to provide an explanation for the level of certainty of evidence, whether for rating down or for rating up the certainty of evidence. In addition, you want to report the overall level of certainty in the body of evidence. So is it high, is it moderate, is it low, or is it very low certainty for each of your outcomes? So with this, we come to the end of Prisma 1. So the first 22 items in the Prisma checklist. Prisma 2 covers items 23 on to items 27. So the aspects of Prisma that has to do with discussion up to publication will be covered in the next Prisma slide, the next topic. So it might be necessary for you to go over this recording multiple times, especially if you are new to systematic in order for you to understand as much as you can. However, these are references that I've used and resources that you can consult for more details. Thank you so much.